On April 30th, 1789, George Washington began his first term as President of the United States. The framers of the Constitution had not described exactly how he should fulfill his duties, but trusted he would become a model of what a president should be. At the time, the President of the United States had no counterpart in a world of nations run by monarchs, and so there were no examples of how a president should behave. As Washington himself put it, "I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." Congress wanted to call him His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of Liberties. But Washington chose the title Mr. President, which is still used today. During the time he was president, he was very careful not to be a king with a different name. Washington knew that whatever he did as president would set the example for all presidents who followed. Since then, and with successive presidencies, the roles of the presidency have become much more clearly defined. The Constitution describes the president's roles in fairly general terms. The president is chief executive, legislative leader, commander-in-chief of the military, and chief diplomat. As chief executive, the president makes sure all laws are carried out. Although presidents can't make laws, they can issue executive orders on a variety of issues as long as they do not violate laws passed by Congress. The president's powers as chief executive are very broad. It is this role that we most think of when we contemplate the immense power of the American presidency. The president also chooses the Supreme Court and other federal judges as part of the system of checks and balances, but Congress must approve the nominees. As a legislative leader, the president recommends new laws to Congress. The president also sets domestic policy, how our country will deal with specific national issues like the economy, and works to convince Congress to support him. Presidents can veto or override any bill, but Congress, in turn, can override the veto. Politics in this arena often involves deal-making and compromise. In the role of Commander-in-Chief, the President is leader of all the armed forces. Although the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war, acting as Commander-in-Chief, several presidents have made war without a declaration by Congress. Presidents may also send troops to foreign countries to protect American interests where a state of war does not exist, but troops can only stay 60 days without the approval of Congress. In the role of chief diplomat, the president oversees foreign policy, which means the president has a major say in determining our relationships with other nations. In addition, two presidential roles not mentioned in the Constitution have evolved from precedents set by previous presidents. First, the president is the leader of his political party, helping the party elect candidates and speaking out on issues important to the party. Another role that has developed over time is chief of state. The president represents our nation all over the world and hosts foreign leaders. In this role, the president also works to create a national unity that bridges political and other differences. Every role of the United States president brings heavy responsibility, and that's a major reason why the individual who holds the position is often considered the most powerful person in the world. In fact, as nations become more interdependent, almost every decision the president makes has an impact not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Considering the many and varied roles assumed by U.S. presidents, what personal qualities do you think an effective president must have?
I have undertaken initiatives in several areas.
Making and conducting a nation's foreign policy is complex, and in the United States, the role of chief diplomat gives the president major responsibility for this function. In this role, President Woodrow Wilson made many trips to Europe to meet with the British, French, and Germans in an attempt to avert World War I. Wilson wanted to create a vehicle for nations to air their differences without going to war. Wilson worked tirelessly to establish the League of Nations in 1919, but his efforts ultimately failed when his own country declined to become a member. The League was dismantled when it failed to prevent World War II, and a new world peace organization, the United Nations, would not be formed until 1945. The President's role as chief diplomat has frequently changed the makeup of global politics.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba.
One example is President John F. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The crisis occurred when the Soviet Union was discovered shipping nuclear materials to Cuba, less than 100 miles off the coast of the United States. With the two nations at the brink of war, President Kennedy stood his ground. After an intense standoff, the Soviet Union dismantled the missile sites in Cuba and turned ships around that were bound for Cuba bearing more missiles. Many historians praise Kennedy for seeking a peaceful solution rather than giving in to the strong pressure from his generals to attack Cuba.
Our destiny lies not...
Early in his first term, President Richard M. Nixon wrote about opening China to diplomatic relations with the United States, a step many believed would be dangerous and would cause conflict with the Soviet Union. But as our chief diplomat, Nixon moved forward and was soon invited to visit China. The week that changed the world, as Nixon called his historic 1972 visit, was covered live on television, and today China is one of our most important trading partners.
A significant achievement in the cause of peace.
Our 39th president, Jimmy Carter, championed human rights around the world. In 1978, he helped bring peace to the Middle East with the Camp David Agreement between Egypt and Israel. Building on the work that President Nixon began, President Carter established full diplomatic relations with China and completed negotiations of the SALT II nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union. After leaving office, President Carter was awarded one of the world's highest honors, the Nobel Peace Prize, and continues to work for peace around the world. Today, the activities of terrorists and extremists can blur national and even regional boundaries. Hotspots like Afghanistan and Iraq, plus the complicated search for peace between Israel, the Palestinians, and the rest of the Arab world, continue to present a difficult set of diplomatic challenges for the President of the United States. How does the President's role as chief diplomat affect you as a citizen of the United States? Presidential travel has an impact on the country's budget. Presidents visit countries around the world to improve international relations, build trade agreements, and resolve crises. It was during William Howard Taft's presidency that a transportation budget was initiated. This was for $25,000, a small sum by today's standards. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first president to fly overseas. Since then, 12 presidents have utilized a presidential plane now known as Air Force One. With the advancement of technology, travel became faster, but costs also increased. When Dwight Eisenhower was flying in the 1950s, it cost about $348 an hour to run the propeller-driven plane. By the 1990s, that cost had risen to $40,000, which is basically for fuel costs. And that's just a small percentage of the cost of a presidential trip. Today, when a president travels, he may be accompanied by over 1,000 federal officials. The total cost of a visit can be over $60 million, a far cry from Taft's $25,000 for a year of travel. Is it important for the federal government to allocate a large budget for presidential travel? Why? Or why not?